Progressive social justice took many forms. In some cases, it was focused on those who suffered due to pervasive inequality. In others, the goal was to help those who were in desperate need due to circumstance. Women were at the forefront of social justice reform. Jane Addams, for example, had led the settlement house movement of the 1880s, which was among the earliest progressive grassroots efforts in the country. Building on those successes, social justice reformers took on other related challenges. For example, the National Child Labor Committee, formed in 1904, urged the passage of labor legislation to ban child labor in the industrial sector. In 1900, U.S. Census records had indicated that 1 out of every 6 children between the ages of 5 and 10 was working for wages, which was a 50% increase over the previous decade. If numbers alone were not enough to encourage action, the fact that managers paid child workers less for their labor gave additional fuel to the efforts to radically curtail child labor. The committee employed photographer Lewis Hine to engage in a decade-long campaign to educate Americans on the plight of children working in factories. Though not immediately successful, by 1938, with the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act as part of the New Deal, labor by children under the age of 16 in the industrial sector was finally outlawed. Other social justice causes were also pursued. Florence Kelley particularly opposed sweatshop labor and urged the passage of an 8-hour workday law in order to specifically protect women in the workplace. Her efforts were initially met with strong resistance from factory owners who exploited women's labor and were unwilling to give up the long hours and low wages they paid in order to offer the cheapest possible products to consumers. But a tragedy turned the tide of public opinion in favor of her cause. On March 25, 1911, a fire broke out in New York City at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company on the 8th floor of the Ash Building. It resulted in the deaths of 146 garment workers, most of them young immigrant women. Management had previously blockaded doors and fire escapes in an effort to control workers and keep out union organizers. In the blaze, many died due to the crush of bodies trying to evacuate the building, and many managers had fled without informing workers, taking the keys to the locked doors with them. Others died when they fell off the flimsy fire escapes or jumped to their deaths to escape the flames. The public was shocked and outraged. Despite a good deal of evidence that the owners and management had been horribly negligent in the fire, a grand jury failed to indict them on manslaughter charges. Still, the massacre for which they were responsible did finally compel the city to enact reform. This tragedy provided the National Consumers League with the moral argument to convince politicians of the need to pass workplace safety laws and codes. In the mid to late 19th century, natural resources were heavily exploited, especially in the West. Land speculators and developers took over large tracts of forest and grazing land, and acreage important to water power was also seized by private concerns. Mining companies practiced improper and wasteful mining practices. Assuming an seemingly inexhaustible supply of natural resources, Americans had developed a tradition of waste. Alarmed by the public's attitude toward natural resources, as well as the exploitation of them for private gain, conservationists called for federal supervision of the nation's resources and the preservation of those resources for future generations. It was in President Theodore Roosevelt that the conservationists found a sympathetic ear. Putting an end to wasteful use of raw materials and the reclamation of large areas of neglected land would be some of the major achievements of the Roosevelt era. Speaking of Roosevelt, when he came to the presidency, he did so because of the assassination of William McKinley. And he'd also accomplished quite a bit. He had graduated with the highest honors from Harvard. He was the author of 23 books and considered a significant authority on North American wildlife. He was a prize-fighting championship finalist, a leader of the Rough Riders, a cowboy, a socialite, a police commissioner, the assistant secretary of the Navy, a governor, and a vice president. And all of this had been accomplished before he even entered the White House. And he was the youngest man to be president, and still is, at just 42 years of age. In terms of his progressive policies, Theodore Roosevelt promised the average citizen fairness, the breaking up of trusts, the regulation of railroads, and pure food and drugs. He called his plan the Square Deal, and it reflected three basic goals: the conservation of natural resources, the control of the corporations, and consumer protection. These three demands are often referred to as the three C's of the Square Deal. It aimed at helping middle-class citizens and involved attacking bad trusts while at the same time protecting business from the most extreme demands of organized labor. Theodore Roosevelt believed that Wall Street financiers and the powerful leaders of the trusts were acting quite foolishly, living in luxurious surroundings while the masses were most definitely not. He felt that there was no limit to their greed, but he had a weapon against big business: the Sherman Antitrust Act, passed by Congress back in 1890. This law declared illegal all combinations that were in restraint of trade. For the most part, it had not been very effective, because courts had routinely sided with businesses when any enforcement of the act had been attempted. But this was going to change under Roosevelt. The first trust he attacked as a monopoly was controlled by the most powerful industrialist in the country, J.P. Morgan. He controlled a railroad company known as the Northern Securities Company, which controlled most railroad shipping across the northern part of the United States. Morgan was actually shocked that Roosevelt would target him and not even bother to give him the courtesy of an advance notice. But Roosevelt felt that Morgan ran a bad trust, and he was targeting those that were taking advantage of people. This was actually the core of Roosevelt's philosophy regarding trusts. He boiled everything down to a case of right versus wrong, or good versus bad. If a trust controlled an entire industry but provided a good service at reasonable rates, it was considered a good trust, and he would leave it alone. Only the bad trusts that increased prices and exploited consumers would face an attack by the Roosevelt administration. The American public was pleased with his actions, and the Supreme Court, in a narrow 5-4 decision, also agreed and ordered the Northern Securities Company dissolved. Roosevelt said confidently that no man, no matter how powerful, was above the law. For consumers, the biggest laws passed had been the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. Both were a direct result of the publication of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle just a few months earlier. The public had been so outraged with the conditions and actions depicted in the book that they had demanded the government do something. The Meat Inspection Act set up a federal grading system and inspection process for all domestic and international meat products, focusing particularly on the handling of meat in the slaughterhouses. The Pure Food and Drug Act required the listing of all ingredients inside of a product, effectively a truth in labeling law. And conservation of the nation's natural resources and beautiful places was, of course, a very high priority for Roosevelt. He raised the national visibility of this issue, and his concern for the environment was influenced by naturalists like John Muir, as well as his own political appointees, including Gifford Pinchot, the chief of forestry, who had previously worked at the Biltmore estate. The president called for a far-reaching program of conservation, reclamation, and irrigation as early as 1901. Working with many individuals and organizations, he was responsible for numerous laws and actions, including the passage of the Newlands Act in 1902, which funded irrigation projects from the proceeds of sales of federal lands in the West, the appointment of the Inland Waterways Commission in 1907, which studied the relations of rivers, soil, forest, and water power development, as well as water transportation, and the National Conservation Commission, established in 1909, which was to develop long-range plans for preserving natural resources. Whereas Roosevelt's predecessors had set aside 46 million acres of timberland for preservation and parks, Roosevelt would increase that 146 million acres, and began efforts to prevent forest fires and to replant areas that had previously been stripped bare. Under an 1891 law that allowed him to declare national forests and withdraw lands from public development, Roosevelt began to preserve wilderness areas, and by the time he left office, 150 million acres of land had been deemed as national forests, safe from being cut down. This amounted to 3 times the total protected land since the law had been enacted. In 1907, Congress passed a law that would block him from protecting any additional territory in 6 states. But in typical Roosevelt fashion, he signed the bill into law, but not before he protected an additional 16 million acres in those states. His appointment of his friend Gifford Pinchot as chief forester would result in a vigorous new scientific management of public lands. By the time he left office, Roosevelt had added 50 wildlife refuges, 5 new national parks, and initiated a system of designating national monuments, such as the Devil's Tower National Monument. And as for labor, under previous presidents, the government hadn't helped and actually had even sent in troops to help break up strikes, assisting business owners. In 1902, though, Pennsylvania coal miners went on strike with no expectation of seeking help from the White House. Their strike began in May of 1902 when they were seeking better wages, shorter hours, and a recognition of their union. But the mine owners refused to negotiate and closed the mines. Attempts to appeal to the owners, even attempts by J.P. Morgan, did not result in any talks. As the days passed, the situation deteriorated and violence began to erupt. As the strike reached into the fall, Roosevelt decided that he needed to intervene, really not knowing how the public would react if the strike continued on into the winter. Now, no president had ever tried to negotiate a strike settlement before, so he invited the representatives from each side to the White House in early October to work out some sort of a compromise. The unions suggested submitting their requests to an arbitrator and abide by the results, so long as the owners would do the same. The owners, though, resented the summons by the president to meet what they were calling a common criminal. They refused any sort of concession. Roosevelt was worried that the violence would increase and the U.S. could be spiraling dangerously towards a class-based civil war. So after those mine owners left Washington, he vowed to end the strike no matter what. He called his Secretary of War, Elihu Root, and ordered him to prepare the army, this time not for use against the strikers. If no settlement was reached, the army was going to seize the mines and make coal available to the public by using the army to operate the mines. And if he needed to, he would draft the coal miners into the army. Roosevelt didn't seem to care that he had no constitutional authority to do any such thing. Eventually, the owners were finally convinced to submit the dispute to an arbitrator, and on October 15th, the strike came to an end. The following March, a decision was reached by the mediators, and the miners were awarded a 10% pay increase, with a reduced workday down to just 8 or 9 hours, depending on the season. But the owners were not forced to recognize the United Mine Workers Union. Workers across America cheered for President Roosevelt for standing up to the mine operators. To them, it seemed as if the White House would lend a helping hand to the labor movement.